Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this important speech. And we move on to our program with the excellent corporate governance and transparency panel. If the panelists can please take their seats. Mr. Mehra, if you can take your seat. The moderator is Mr. Robert MacDonald, writer, broadcaster specializing in Greek affairs, regional government, regional correspondent, economic intelligence unit for the Greece and the United Kingdom. The speakers are Mr. John Wilcox, chairman of Sodali Limited, chairman of the Cross-Border Voting Committee of the International Corporate Governance Network of the UK, Dr. Madhav Mehra, President, World Council for Corporate Governance, the UK, Dr. Dimitris Tsibanoulis, Managing Partner, Tsibanoulis and Partners Law Firm, Greece, Mr. Konstantinos Bakouris, President of Transparency International, Greece, and Mr. Robert Sikelis, General Counsel and Regional Compliance Officer of Siemens SA. Mr. MacDonald, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Azunis. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first panel session of the afternoon on corporate governance and transparency. Now, whereas most of your previous sessions have taken corporate governance with a bias in favor of the environment and taken it as a given, our session is going to deal, in some respects, more with the notion of corporate governance per se and how it has contributed to the global financial crisis, particularly in the light of what Dr. Mehra had to say in his bravura performance. You've all heard his description now of the dynamic interplay between transparency and good governance. He's joining us for further discussion. I hope our format is that each of the speakers will speak for about 4 minutes, answer a few questions from me, a little bit of discussion between them, and then I hope we have time to open the floor to questions from the floor. I'd like to start today with Konstantin Bakouris, the President of Transparency International, please. Mr. Bakouris.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important conference. And as a matter of fact, listening to Dr. Mehra with the pathos, as we call it in Greece, with which he talked about transparency, it makes my life much easier. So therefore, I'd like to start by giving a brief background information about Transparency International. For those who don't know, it is a non-governmental organization founded in 1993 by Peter Eigen, an executive of the World Bank, to fight corruption, which, as we all know, is rampant across the entire world. Soon after, many distinguished individuals from the international community have joined the organization to make it a formal global movement that fights graft. Only 3 years later, from the beginning of the organization, the economists acknowledged that Transparency International was the one that brought the problem of corruption into the open. By now, Transparency International has more than 100 active chapters around the world. It publishes annually the CPI, which is the famous Corruption Perception Index. It works closely with many organizations like the OECD, the United Nations, the World Bank, as well as many other NGOs with similar objectives. And it produces many tools available to both government and the private sector in order to fight corruption. For example, the Integrity Pact, the business principles for countering bribery, the source book, which is a comprehensive toolkit, and many others. We, the TI Greece, were founded 3 years later, that is in 1996, and we have been active ever since. We are conducting annual surveys about the levels of corruption in our country. We organize major conferences, we issue position papers, publish articles, arrange meetings with ministers and other public officials. And of course, we try to do two things. Number one, to raise the level of awareness about corruption on one hand, and on the other hand is to cause the officials to act. We lately have embarked on a campaign to mobilize the entire society to actively fight corruption practices by adhering to a 10 Commandments document. Unfortunately, our surveys indicate that there is no progress to fight corruption in Greece. Our last survey shows some worsening of the levels of corruption, while the 2008 CPI ranks Greece 57th out of 180 countries, 23rd in the EEC of 27, and last in the EEC of 15, with a grade of 4.7 in the scale of 1 to 10, where 10 stands for the least corrupt countries. Last year, here in Greece, we hosted the International Conference Against Corruption. The conclusion was that the global conference, the global challenges of security, natural resources, and particularly environment, as well as sustainable development, cannot be effectively resolved unless we address the issue of corruption, which is in the core of these challenges. In the fight, of course, of corruption, the private sector has a major role to play. Otherwise, its credibility and, of course, its existence is in doubt. Corporate practices that do not respect the environment, the rights of employees, the local communities, the customer needs, the laws of the states are putting at risk their own viability and, at the same time, the social cohesion. And, of course, historically, we have seen the leadership of many companies that do not adopt governance strategies with a long-term view, but indulge themselves in management practices that aim to maximize short-term profits, quarterly results, huge bonuses, and at the same time abandoning basic values that characterize civil societies. And of course, the results are well known: squandering of valuable resources, destruction of the environment, increased corruption, and weakening of the democratic institutions. It is therefore a good opportunity to examine the relationship of transparency and corporate governance in light of two important realities. First, that the confidence of society towards business is at its lower level, and second, that the manner for which companies used to operate up to now will change, whether from within or externally enforced. Over the past few years, there has been a lot of discussion regarding transparency and corporate governance. Most company commitments were rather theoretical and less strategic. We are against corporate social responsibility practices that make commitments at various presentations that cannot be proven, present communication programs for social issues that cannot be measured, plan for growth that ignores the need of social cohesion and the respect of the environment. We recommend corporate social responsibility practices that they are part of a holistic strategic plan that addresses such issues as the process that decisions are made to safeguard transparency, the systematic interface of all functions, particularly the ones that affect third parties, and that the social policies that should contribute substantially towards the solution of social problems are at social issues both at the local and international level. There is no doubt that the private sector, which produces wealth but operates without values and without social responsibility, can cause catastrophic consequences to the global economy. I believe this is exactly what we are experiencing today. I also believe that corporate governance must embrace the principles of corporate social responsibility and business ethics so that the present climate is reversed and that healthy growth characterized about transparency and about accountability is resumed. And that's the few things I wanted to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rakouris. You make a point here that corporate practices that do not respect the environment, the rights of the employees, the local communities, customer needs, and the laws of the state are putting at risk their own viability. Is there a correlation between, or a conflict between profit maximization and corporate social responsibility?
I believe it is. I think if we go back even to the original Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, in which he defined the role of the business as to maximize profit in the long run. And if we consider that companies do not operate in a vacuum, that they operate within communities, they use employees, they use suppliers, they have customers, and they operate within a state, and they have to follow rules and laws. If they don't do those things, they are doing that to their own demise. And we have seen that. All we have to do is just look at the Fortune 500 over the last 50 years, and you will see what has happened to many companies who don't think in those terms. So I think these things are important parameters if you want to really maximize profitability in the long term.
Now, as I understand it, Transparency International really is in the business of naming and shaming, as it were. A country either complies and does well or it doesn't, and Greece would seem, from your numbers, to do very poorly. Is there something more that should or could be done? Should it be regulation, or do you want it to be done by demonstration, by guidance, rather than by regulation?
Well, in a society, there are two things that can be done. One is how do you save and you improve the present generation, the people, and you cannot do that if there is absence of values and ethical standards. You need to have compliance and you have to have rules, and at the same time you have to look long term for the future. You need to generate good citizens, because at the end, if you have the best laws, if you have the best rules, if everything is okay, if you have no good citizens, nothing's going to happen. So I think you need to do two things. One is to try to develop a better generation, to try to instill the ethical values, to do all the things that our doctor mentioned today, and at the same time, you need to have rules and to comply with. But essentially, people have to realize what Dr. Mehra called it competitiveness. We say that transparency pays. It is a good thing, because if you really recognize that business do not prosper in an environment and in a community which is corrupt, a community which is not healthy, the business cannot be developed. So therefore, it is to their own interest that they have to do that. And if you look, for example, in the World Economic Forum, where you see every year which ones are the most competitive countries, you will see the Scandinavian, Switzerland, a few others, the 10. And if at the same time you take the corruption perception index of the Transparency International, you see that the least corrupt countries are those which are at the same time are the most competitive. So there's a tremendous correlation between the two.
But can it only be done by persuasion? Does it need regulation?
I believe that we need both.
And Transparency International doesn't see any role for itself in anything by way of regulation, only in providing guidelines for good governance.
Well, Transparency International is trying to do 2 or 3 things. One is trying to raise the level of the people that we have a problem. And I think worldwide, I think it has been recognized, and in Greece more and more you will see that people do that. So I think it's not only us, but it's all the things that happens. This is happening. The next thing is, what do you do about it? So therefore, what you do about it, we have come to the conclusion that the only way to do it is to be able to convince the people that, and to mobilize them that not only they complain, but they act. So therefore, it is that together we're going to solve it, and together we have to do it. And that's why we have prepared 10 commandments of what not to do as a citizen. And that's why we're trying to convince the politicians at least to look at the problem of corruption, not as a political tool who want to accuse the other, but basically that to recognize that this is a national issue, that we have to get together, admit it, and try to see what we're going to do.
Thank you, Mr. Magouris. I'd like to turn now, please, to John Wilcox, the chairman of the consultancy firm Sodali, if that's how I pronounce it properly. And please, your comments, sir.
Thank you very much. The correct pronunciation is Sodali.
Thank you.
And as you can see from my CV, I have 30 years of history working as a service provider to corporations, 4 years working as the head of corporate governance at one of the world's most responsible institutional investors. And from those experiences, I have a very firm belief that the owners of companies and the investors in companies and the companies themselves have a shared objective, which is value creation. And that the kind of confrontational relationship that has traditionally existed between corporations and their owners is not necessary. And in fact, Sodali, the company of which I am chairman, which is a corporate governance consultancy and a service provider to corporations in Europe and developing markets, not in the United States, is founded on that principle. There was a quote from our previous speaker, Ambassador Speckard. He said, "The private sector is the key." I firmly believe that that is true, and that's why we're here in this room. That's why we are talking about corporate governance. I have a somewhat simpler definition of corporate governance than Dr. Meras, and that is, it is the proper allocation of power and responsibility amongst the managers and executives of the company, the owners and shareholders of the company, and the directors of a company. And this is a definition which applies to private companies as well as to listed, publicly traded companies. The three main constituents of a corporation structurally in terms of governance are those who run it, the managers, those who have contributed their capital, and then the directors who have the very difficult job of overseeing the legality and the proper functioning of this enterprise. A corporation is, of course, a legal creation. It is a creation of the communities of law. It is granted special privileges by law, of which the major one is limited liability, but also various tax privileges and so forth. As a legal creation of the community, the corporation has many duties and responsibilities back to the community to whom it owes its life. We have forgotten that. And I think that the subject of this conference, which is how to ensure that, or at least of this panel, how to ensure that the private sector and the business units, which work so well as an organizing principle, are reminded of their responsibilities to the community and to the globe. We're in an absolutely perfect moment to remind ourselves of this question because of the perfect storm of the global economic crisis, which Dr. Mera described so emphatically. There have been several results from this economic crisis. A general awakening to the cultural lapses that had affected both companies and society general, the mistaken values that he described so emphatically. It has also created a lot of public interest and media attention. Politicians are getting involved. So this is a moment in which we can discuss corporate governance, and it has meaning to a much larger audience than it ever did before. There are a number of results of this set of events, this economic crisis, and its impact on governance that I will just spell out very quickly. The first is there is an acceleration of corporate governance reforms. Many of these are quite technical. They have been around sometimes for many, many years. The corporate governance movement, at least in the United States, dates back to 1985, 87, and that date marks the first time that large institutional investors began to sponsor shareholder resolutions on their own initiative. Before that, shareholder activism had primarily been a matter of special interest groups and gadflies. So these reforms, which are intended to create best practices, to improve the structures, and to improve that allocation of power and responsibilities that I described as the definition of governance, are accelerating, and I believe that many of them will be achieved in many different markets within the next year as a result of the increased pressure from the economic crisis that we are in now. There is a wholesale review of remuneration with some government impact, which is unfortunate because government regulation of remuneration means one size fits all, which is never a good thing for private enterprise. Nevertheless, it will be a help in fundamentally changing the underlying cultural issues that have run amok because of excesses and abuses in remuneration. CEOs of corporations are not rock stars. They are not sports stars. They should not be glamorized and celebritized as they have been for the past decade. They should go back to doing the job of running the company and should accept that that job is one that involves the mantle of responsibility, not the mantle of privilege and self-aggrandizement. The board of directors' job is being substantially redefined by the corporate governance movement and by the economic crisis. Boards of directors are now viewed as being the primary nexus of responsibility, both for the effective strategy of the business and for the lawful operation of the business and for the attention to issues that we're discussing here today of proper environmental practices and community responsibility. So the board of directors is no longer a group of revered, aging, successful businessmen who are in that slot only because they have gray hair and good credentials. It is now a job, and I agree very strenuously with Dr. Mera's suggestion that diversity in the boardroom is only one of the many changes that we are seeing taking place. Fourth, there is an enlarged definition of corporate governance. It is no longer just about tweaking the structure of the board, the committee structure, best practices. It has become a strategic and economic mandate for companies. The board's role, as I described, has changed. Strategy now encompasses good governance. Good governance is recognized as a risk reduction factor, as well as creating opportunities for improved business. There has also been a new effort, starting to be a new effort on the part of companies to conduct outreach to their owners, rather than sitting and waiting for an engagement by the shareholders to reach it. This has been the traditional practice. The shareholders are the one who jump around and dance and complain and submit shareholder resolutions. But why should that be the case? The corporation should be going out, meeting and embracing its owners, finding out what their concerns are, talking to the larger community of stakeholders, finding out what their concerns are, and acting upon that dialogue. They do that now very effectively with their customers because the customers are viewed as the source of revenue. But the larger communities of stakeholders are also essential to the success of a business. Shareholder responsibility as well is now in focus, and I think what we will see within the next year or two and beyond is the corporate governance spotlight turned precisely on to those who turned it on in the first place, and that is the shareholders themselves. The way in which institutional investors are governed, the way in which they behave, the way in which they exercise their voting rights and their other ownership responsibilities are critical issues that have been under-examined and deserve the same level of attention that has been directed at corporations. I should add that corporate governance is extremely relevant to private companies as well as to public companies. Most of the dialogue has been about the large global listed companies. But in Europe, where so many companies, even when listed, have family ownership groups or shareholder groups that control them and feel that they're entitled to give less attention to their minority shareholders, which is the term that is used here, not used in the United States, interestingly, that attitude has to change. Private companies can benefit from good corporate governance in exactly the same way that public companies can. Finally, let me make a couple of predictions. One, I believe that corporations are going to embrace corporate governance and recognize that it has great strategic value for them, both in terms of risk reduction, and if you look in the environment, we are talking about cost savings over the long term. We are talking about litigation costs, cleanup costs, regulatory penalties, and also the opportunities that arise from proper behavior and good governance. More satisfied customers, better reputation, more creative opportunities to develop new products. We heard President Obama describing how he is going to develop jobs by filling the need that we all understand for ways to operate green, to avoid waste, environmental pollution, and to come up with new technologies. Corporations should be thinking and are thinking along the same lines. So corporations will start to embrace governance actively rather than seeing it simply as a compliance requirement. Shareholder proposals and shareholder activism, I believe, will decline, being replaced by dialogue. As the owners become more effectively part of the company, I believe that they will no longer need to use these largely ineffective, although highly visible tactics of hitting at the company from the outside, but will be able to work from within. And here again, private equity offers an example of how that can work, and that can be applied to public companies as well. And finally, I believe that the culture, the attitudes, and the behavior that has dominated companies and that Dr. Mara described so vividly will change. As I said, the mantle of responsibility will replace the assumptions of an entitlement that have made so many companies behave so poorly over the past decade.
Thank you. You've divided the ownership of corporations or the running of corporations amongst managers, investors, and directors. And in the end, in your closing remarks, you raised the question of private equity investors. Do they or should they be more closely regulated? Because they are seen to be, whether they are or not, they are seen to be a major part of the current problem.
You're talking about private equity?
Yes.
They already are. They're very closely regulated.
But
there
not
are
to
tax
some people's
regulations.
minds.
There are lots of laws that apply to private equity. They are not under-regulated.
Well, that's a question, if we get to the floor, you might wish to be challenged upon. The other point was directors. Dr. Bader spoke of the need for directors who are independent, not independent directors. How do you ensure that?
That's a very good question. One way to ensure it is to increase the transparency of the board's decision-making process. We need a window into the boardroom. This is something that shareholders have been asking for a long time, and this is one of the objectives of corporate governance reforms, to open a window into the boardroom, not a door. The shareholders don't want to be in there. They can't legally, but they want to know what's going on and how their elected representatives are doing their job. So take, for example, executive remuneration. This is one of those issues where shareholders are going to be pulling in one direction. They want to keep costs down. They want to make sure that remuneration is not excessive and that it's linked to the performance of the company. The managers are going to be pushing for more money and saying, gee, you know, to be competitive, so-and-so earns so much at that company over there. We've got to pay the same thing or we're not going to get the executive talent. It's the job of the board of directors to reach a balanced decision, to reconcile those two competing but equally valid pulls of the owners and the managers of the company. And then they need to explain to us how they have made that decision. That is the window that we need. We need to know how compensation decisions are made, how takeover defense decisions are made, how capital structure decisions are made. These are all issues where there's some tension between what the owners want and what the managers want. And we need much greater and clearer articulation of how the board of directors is making those decisions and how their decisions are structured in such a way as to drive the creation of long-term value, which is the objective of the shareholders and of the company as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn, moving on quickly because we're rapidly running down in time, to Dimitris Tsimpanoulis, a lawyer who specializes in matters concerning corporate governance. He's going to take us back a little bit towards the green aspect of our debate.
Thank you. The issues that corporate governance addresses are as old as the exercise of business activity. Law and economics, politics and society have on many occasions dealt with issues relating to the organization and operation of business enterprises. The main issue, of course, is on the basis of whose interests should corporations be governed. Holding the balance between individual and communal goals, as well as between economic and social goals of a company, is not an easy task. Could the interests of the corporation, stakeholders, and the society be aligned as nearly as possible in a commonly satisfactory manner? The prerequisite for answering this question is that these conflicting interests should first be defined and then set in order of precedence. What is the role of law in this whole conflict and collision procedure? Should the lawmaker take a stand for the purposes of imposing the protection of particular interests? And if so, whose interest, under what hierarchy, at which cost, and in which manner? Corporate governance is inextricably linked to the social environment, the political situation, and the surrounding circumstances. It is therefore not surprising that in the early 70s and well in the beginning of the 80s, a very much debated topic in Europe on which both legal theory and national assemblies dealt with at length was the protection and enhancement of the workers' rights in the corporations. We know very well the discussion about Mitbestimmung in Germany. Further, it is not a coincidence that since the beginning of the 90s, the topic of corporate governance has re-emerged and is strongly debated on an international level from a different perspective, that of capital markets and investor protection. This is mainly linked to the primary role of capital markets in the globalized economy, where restrictions to the free movement of capital have either been completely lifted or strongly limited. Nowadays, there is a growing public consensus that both individuals and corporations have an ethical obligation to conserve and protect the environment as a common inheritance. The problem is that environmentally sound decisions often don't mirror those that optimize corporate profits. You will say, and you say that on long term, yes, but often it is the short term, and we have seen that in the recent financial turmoil, and the De La Rosière report points this issue that everyone had the short-term perspective, unfortunately. So the problem is that environmentally sound decisions often don't mirror those that optimize corporate profits. The design and production of a less polluting product may satisfy a greater social good, but it may be difficult to justify the lost profits associated with research and development until there is a market for such a product, for a vehicle, for example. So we can have the dilemma, environmental responsibility versus maximization of shareholder value. We thus revert to the basic policy issue mentioned before as the role of the law and the lawmaker with regard to the environment protection and the business's operation. Although we all, whether lawyers or economists, would agree upon the need to protect the environment, there is intense debate and considerable difference in respect of the means whereby these objectives may be achieved in terms of corporate law and capital markets law. How are such rules to be instituted? Through mandatory legislation? Through self-regulation? Through soft law? In a mixed system, the mixture of corporate law, environmental law, and securities regulation cannot be left, I think, to the market, only to the market, but has to be determined by collective choice, that is to say, by the legislator. It would be an illusion to accept that market powers alone could drive a company to a green policy. However, efforts to mandatorily legislate social responsibility of domestic companies by imposing them specific behavioral restrictions could have the opposite effect, because managers could take only the minimal actions required and avoid larger moral questions. A paternalistic approach could lead to an even greater erosion of corporate social responsibility, and especially in today's global economy, where we have the possibility of regulatory arbitrage and forum shopping. Markets can only reflect the preferences of market participants. Since the environment is not a participant of financial markets, only under rather exceptional circumstances, if at all, environmental responsibility will be reflected in the signals of these markets. It is, I think, a mere illusion to assume that shareholders will act as agents to the interest of the environment by acknowledging that the environment must be protected in some way against shareholders' value in order to allow the corporation to be managed effectively. Legislators, presuming that firms should not be managed to the sole interest of shareholders, but also to the public interest, which contains other stakeholders' interest in environmental responsibility, would be ill-advised to drop this task only to the market forces. Let me conclude by presenting my positions. Legal incentives for companies' respective environmental responsibility principles are necessary. Lawmakers should have the courage and the inventiveness to introduce rational acts to adjust the corporate and capital markets law to both the facts and the needs of the 21st century. Companies should be granted incentives to become more responsive, not only to their shareholders and stakeholders, but also to the public at large. And here we should recognize an important role for the environment. The legislator should adopt green compensation policies for companies adopting environmental responsibility models or active in the green industry, so-called maybe green companies. Such incentive schemes could include lower taxation of dividends, reforms going forward on the structure of remuneration, a new structure of the management and employees' remuneration, implementing management and labor incentives such as lower taxation. In this framework, corporate governance codes will be the necessary supplement for such rules, in order to ensure corporate accountability. Finally, tax incentives should be introduced for green institutional investors, and special flagging of green companies in the stock exchange are advisable.
Thank you very much. So incentives to promote better responsibility on the part of companies with some degree of regulation. I'm going to, without asking you questions, perhaps if people have questions from the floor, they can take them up with Mr. Simbanulis afterwards. But because we're under pressure of time, I'm going to go directly to Robert Sikelis, who is General Counsel and Regional Compliance Officer for Siemens, who has very close and immediate experience of the whole problem of corporate governance. I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't know what the problems of Siemens have been. They have been found guilty and paid a huge fine of 2 billion euros for having allegedly paid bribes for public procurement contracts. This is in the United States. They're currently under investigation in Greece. Mr. Sikelis has very kindly agreed to say a few words about what has happened, what Siemens is doing about it, and what the effect has been on the company.
I too would like to thank the conference, thank you, and thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to come here and meet with you. For some reason, some of what you've just heard, given that we're from Siemens, they seem to think that we might be able to provide important concrete examples in terms of when things go wrong from a corporate governance and compliance perspective. I think they were surprised when I actually accepted to come here. But when I saw the composition of today's panelists, Mr. Bakuris, Dr. Mahara, and the rest of the esteemed panelists, who stand for principles that were, in some instances, in many instances, Siemens has achieved and others are striving hard to accomplish, I saw it as an opportunity that I would not pass up and could not pass up. I'm sorry, a little trouble hearing, okay. So, what are the options and consequences for...
No.
What are the options and consequences for a company like Siemens that's utterly failed in an important part of its corporate governance responsibilities in the area of compliance? For reasons which I trust are obvious, I will not discuss in detail past or specific allegations. Suffice it to say, for purposes of setting the context, let me try to get this... So for purposes setting the context, an independent investigation uncovered systematic violations of anti-corruption laws and accounting regulations in many Siemens businesses and regions around the world. That's well known. So what are the options for a company facing such a scandal like Siemens? As a former prosecutor who for 10 years in the United States investigated and prosecuted such cases, I know that there are a number of options, but they usually boil down to just one viable option for such a corporation. My past experience tells me that you'll hire a team of lawyers, you'll fight the charges, conduct your own internal investigation, they'll do whatever's necessary to protect the company. This leads almost always to tremendous challenges and costs, both to the prosecutor and the company, and the investigation and resulting prosecution, if any, could take many years. And the truth of what actually happened, or parts of it, may eventually come out, but rarely the full scope of what has actually taken place. Siemens took an entirely different approach, and one that when I first heard about it surprised me. It surprised me because, in my view, it's unprecedented in corporate history. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I ended up joining Siemens about a year ago. Having since joined the company, though, and having gotten to know the people who made this decision, it does not come as a surprise to me any longer. The approach was one of complete openness, transparency, and cooperation. We hired It's an independent investigative firm, Debevoise in Plimpton, based out of the United States. They were given the mandate to conduct a thorough and independent investigation, which they did, and they were given an additional mandate to be, as was everyone else in Siemens, to be fully cooperative with investigating authorities around the world, and that was done. What this meant in practice to Siemens was obviously complete transparency, total openness. There was no opportunity or a desire or an intent to hide the past wrongdoings. At the same time, though, Siemens embarked on creating a world-class compliance program, which I think some people in this room, Dr. Bakours and others, are now familiar with. The costs of this undertaking were tremendous, not only financial costs, because that's almost, even though it reaches into the billions, that's almost the least of it. The cost of the reputational damage, the cost to the relationships that had been built in different countries, a country like Greece, for example, and so those are the options and costs with respect to a company facing something like Siemens.
Well, how do you quantify these costs?
Well, the financial side of it you can quantify very simply. I mean, those numbers exist. There's invoices coming in from dozens, there were, not any longer, hundreds of lawyers around the world, dozens of accountants, investigators, and the like. So those are easily quantifiable because there's a record kept of those, as are the fines that have been paid, billions of dollars of fines in the United States and in other places. What you can't quantify accurately, of course, is the reputational damage. Siemens, a company over 160 years in business, has had for most of that, a wonderful reputation of both in the area of corporate governance and in a number of, virtually every corporate area. It's one of the largest companies in the world. How do you quantify the reputational damage that something like this has caused to Siemens? It's hard to tell. Only time will tell. But I think by taking the approach, and maybe this factored into the initial analysis, by taking the approach that they did, I think you go a long way in trying to rectify the damage that was caused.
But you talk about having put this major compliance program in place. There are still a lot of people who out there I know who feel that you paid $2 billion to the United States, or 2 billion euros, I can't remember which, in order to buy your way out of a hole. Are you happy that that compliance program is going to be valid going forward?
Am I happy that the compliance program, am I convinced of it?
Are you convinced of it?
Absolutely, and I will tell you why. Not so much because of the program and processes and controls that are in place, and we could talk a little bit about those as well if you wanted to, because there are many, but more because the commitment that you see in Siemens from the top, from Peter Loscher, who's the overall CEO, to Mr. Xinis, who's here today, who's the CEO of Siemens in Athens, the commitment to openness, the commitment to transparency, the commitment to clean business. It's the tone from the top that you hear in the compliance circles. The tone from the top is loud, clear, and rings through to every single employee that it's only clean business, and that's the only approach that Siemens is going to take going forward.
I can give you one shareholder viewpoint on what Siemens did, which they did extremely well. I was the head of corporate governance at TIAA-CREF in the United States, a very large retirement system, the world's largest private retirement system. And Siemens arranged to come and see me and to see our analysts and portfolio managers, because we were major owners of the company. It included their then chairman, Gerhard Krome, who was a very important figure in corporate governance in Germany, their new CEO, their investor at that time, Peter Loscher, their chief financial officer, and their investor relations officer. And they had a very candid discussion with us about the situation, sought input from us as to what were our concerns, and engaged in a very productive dialogue. Later, when it came time for the election of directors, Dr. Krome called me personally to advise me of the names of the new candidates for the board who are being brought on to try and deal with this situation. That was an extremely unusual example of candor and outreach by a company in trouble. It is a very good example of what should be done, but is not done often enough by companies in trouble.
And
So
for the
the
record, I
marriage
don't know
of,
Mr. Wilcox, I just met him.
Right, this is not set up, it just happened to be. This was an actual situation, and here we are sitting side by side. We've never met before.
So the marriage of management and investors that you spoke about in
Yes.
your presentation.
Absolutely.
Siemens is a major investor here in Greece. I think it's about 8,000 people you employ in total. Can you very briefly, because of questions of time, elaborate on what specifically you're doing in the Greek context?
It'd be almost easier to discuss what we're not doing, both globally and here in Greece. Siemens is an entirely new company. There's all new top management in place and some lower level management as well. The full compliance program that's been implemented globally by Siemens has been implemented very successfully and very early here in Greece. We have our new CEO here who, as I mentioned, has made it very clear to everyone that only clean business is our business. I'm here as well. I'm new, a former prosecutor. I'm not going to associate myself with any of that kind of activity. Importantly, though, you can put in all the controls, internal controls, and there's many that have been put in place. Consolidation of bank accounts, what we call the LOA process, guidelines, employee trainings. There's hundreds of things that constitute our compliance program now. But unless you develop a culture or try to develop a culture of integrity where it's made clear to everyone that there's only one form of business that's acceptable, and that's toned from the top, coming from the top all the way through, you're not going to change it. There's no number of processes and procedures. They'll catch most of it, but you're not going to change that culture. And I think that's what Siemens has been successful in doing since this scandal, is both implementing compliance programs. It's kind of like the carrot and the stick. I mean, you have the stick, the compliance program, which watches over everything, consolidates bank accounts, doesn't allow room for what was happening to ever happen again, and that's audited by external auditors and the like. And then you have the carrot approach as well, the values-based, the rules-based, the values-based approach, the cultural approach, and making it clear that activity is just not tolerated.
The clock says 00000, which says we've done our hour. Dr. Mekra, I'm going to perhaps abrogate my responsibilities and ask you if you would like to summarize in a very brief moment.
Thank you so much, Robert, and I'm very fortunate that I'm amongst such distinguished people who have had so much experience in corporate governance and running the companies. I would like to, of course, also make an observation about Siemens, because you see, it's important that we must not stereotype. It's important that we would need to re-script. I have an experience of knowing Siemens. I don't want to go into details, but I found Siemens to be one of the very open companies. I've been involved in Siemens, and it's unfortunate. I don't want to go into the issues, but I have a different take. I think we now need to look at the world totally differently the way we have been doing. If we want to make a change, we need to re-script ourselves. Let's first look at corporate governance. And I'm very glad, and I must compliment the organizers, that they took up the issue of corporate governance and transparency. And I like to bring the close relationship, why it is so. Why corporate governance without transparency is meaningless. What is corporate governance? My friend Robert is a very distinguished person with a tremendously experienced organization, ICGN and the pension funds. Let me give you my take on this. This is here the corporate governance was born when Athens started its first council to run the company's affairs. When a community gives its power, vests in a group of people, it gets into a relationship which we call today principal-agent issue. Good old days, that did not bother, because once you elected, you could do very little. This is the cradle of democracy where a certain degree of democracy started. but there were no information flows. You see, there were no information flows between the people who have divested their power and the people who were using it. So it was fine, fine. That is what has changed today. What has changed today is the dynamics of the interflow, which will improve the quality of decision making of the role of that group where the power today vests, and that is the board. The board's role in determining, that's what the whole purpose of corporate governance is about. And that's what the purpose will not be, in fact, in any way accomplished by putting it into the holes of laws. Of course, it is very necessary. You have to have. The law is very important because otherwise we do not function, and that's where the issues of whole private equity, hedge funds, investment bank, all, they have to be looked together only for one purpose. Is the information inflow and outflow transparent or not? Why transparent? Because when you want to do something good, even when you don't do it, you tell everybody. There are cigarette manufacturing companies who, in fact, will spend barely 100 million pounds on certain degree of social responsibility work and spend 300 million pounds in advertising it. You see? So the issue, therefore, is how you are actually dealing with it. Because today's society, you simply cannot fool people. That's it. The other issue which we must know, why I'm saying we need to re-script ourselves. Unless we empower people to make mistakes and tell them that you must wear your failures as a badges of honor, our quality of decision making is not going to improve. Neither Jeffrey Skilling nor Kenneth Lay joined Enron to really screw up the shareholders. We must understand that. They had no intention of doing that. But when things go wrong, in a heated atmosphere of today's turbulent world, everybody comes and gives you everybody what's going to happen tomorrow. Does anybody happen tomorrow? Let me share with you, on the 6th of January, 2007, I was in Barbados. Barack Obama had not even announced his elections. Not one of those 300 leaders had heard the name of Barack Obama. When I mentioned to them about his speech, The Audacity, the Hope, which he delivered in the convention in July 2004, would you have believed that a man called Barack Hussein Obama is going to be the president of the United States and today determine the world economy in a way which is totally restricted from last year? Understand that. Unless we can understand that, he's a man of just 44. Just think, 44. And just think when you read his book and understand the man, how he was born. He made tremendous mistakes. He talked about of a very ordinary, he came from fairly good black background, all right, but they were not. But he admitted that I got into a party of drug abuse and alcohol when he joined the Occidental College. He had the ability to make mistakes. Why can't we create a society which says, how many mistakes? Let's say, let us celebrate people who are owning their failures. Can we do that? Because unless you are prepared to do that, you will not improve. We are talking of innovation. We are talking today of changing things. Think about Bill Gates. Think of people who created money. How are they creating money? They're bringing products. Think of Siemens, Think of the products which you cannot imagine. But once you bring it to the market, people wonder, how did they ever live without it? So we need to look into the totality of the context. And therefore, we need to re-script what is. Yes, I agree with my friend that basically corporate governance is about allocation of resources, 100% right. But that's not all. Corporate governance today is, in fact, the means, proper means to produce wealth for the society. There was an issue. Whose wealth? Who? What is a corporation? What does corporation? Corporation does not even have a soul, doesn't have an entity. Who are we working for? We are working for the stakeholders. And the biggest problem, and this is where the US law needs to be looked into, biggest problem is shareholders do not create wealth. If corporate governance is for the purpose of the shareholders, it's not going to work. Why? Why am I here? Where are the employees in corporate governance? Is there an equation in corporate governance? Employees constitute 70% of the assets of a corporation. Look at companies today which come with new stock, and suddenly the value goes up. Why? Because they want to know who are the people behind it. Where is their value? You are not looking at the value. Our valuation system today, why this whole thing has come up? Because we adopted a system of mark-to-markets, which used to be their good old days. We forgot about it when we made CDOs, and we gave them AAA rating in the hope that they will do some future something, which they could not do. We must understand the mechanism. It's a good wake-up call for us to reconsider the system which we have the product, where this whole meltdown has come because of a few people. Greece did not commit any financial horrors. China did not do, India did not do. Wall Street, which in fact had the entire financial system under its grip, they did that, And they have been doing it, not today, for a long time. Why? Because the flow of information with people who run Wall Street and the people who are stakeholders was simply not there. It was opaque. It was not transparent. And bad news is it is still going to happen, because you can see the clamors have started coming in. Market is moving a little bit, and lots of people have suddenly come up. Oh, private equity, no, you cannot regulate them. Why? Because the money will go out from your country. People will not invest in Greece. Why did UK not adopt SOX? Not because, they did not adopt because who will list in City Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange? Why is Christopher Cox decided to roll down Cox? We must understand, and we have a very, and he would be able to bear me out. Christopher Cox decided to roll down corporate or this thing only because nobody would list in New York Stock Exchange because of Sarbanes-Oxley. So they wanted to dilute the system. That's why what I'm saying is make it principle-based. You see, the purpose of corporate governance is to create value in the company for the shareholders, not for the shareholders alone. Stakeholders, employees, if customers did not pay you money, did not buy your product, who will create wealth, No measure of law will create wealth for any corporation. If the customer does not buy, let the customers come. And UK have got tremendous examples. I can tell you, Body Shop is a classic example. That woman came from nowhere. Forget about what happened later on. I'm talking about where she started from. Anita Roddick. Anita Roddick just told you that we actually sell our products, you see, I grew up in an atmosphere where we used to, in fact, have these hunts, organize the hunts. But in Anita Roddick's, the slogan was that we don't hurt the animals, So that is brought thousands and hundreds of thousands of teenagers to our shop in 1990s. How did we do that, So we have an example. Marks and Spencer, I can tell you, UK is a live example, and so I want you to really go into that more deeply. There are Nikes, and Nikes is a classic example, 2002. 2002, Nikes was caught by using slave labor in Bangladesh and India. And what happened is you can actually see the graph. Their valuation went half. These are facts. Why have you? And as I mentioned to you, I can give you numerous examples in India, even China and other places where people have created value only by following this. So I don't believe that's an obligation. No, CSR is not an obligation. CSR is the way of doing business. Unless you understand that CSR has to be embedded in the boardroom, unless you understand that corporate social responsibility is the way to sell your products to 2 billion teenagers. Because think about you. What is the time when you really buy? It's your teenagers who today decide what tie if my father is going to wear and what makeup my mother is going to use. Please understand that. Who are the drivers? And they have become very choosy. And they're very choosy about companies, are they socially or environmentally good or not.
Dr. Mekra, thank you very much.
We've
run well over time, I'm afraid, and we're running into the next session. Okay. If anybody has any of these points they'd like to take up with Dr. Mekra in the coffee break in half an hour's time, please do, and I believe the rest of our panel will be here as well. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I think to sum up, the answer is